And as Donald Trump returns to the White House, his opponents are gearing up for another 4 years of resistance. Many of them are artists, musicians, writers, and other creatives overwhelmingly endorsed his rival Kamala Harris in the presidential election in November, but to little avail. My guest today is Amber Massey Blomfield, who is the author of Acts of Resistance, The Power of Art to Create a Better World. It's a study of art as a form of political activism. Good morning, Amber. Thank you very much for joining us. Your book is a study of the way in which artists have worked political resistance into their own art, and also perhaps participated in a broader sense with resistance. With the return of Donald Trump and a lot of other things happening around the world, are we entering a particularly challenging period for resistance in general and also by artists?
Yes, I mean, thank you so much for having me, Oliver. And what a moment to be talking about this book. I started thinking about this book back in 2016, the first time Donald Trump was elected. And really, it came from, I've spent my career as a theatre producer. And I had a moment in the wake of Brexit, in the wake of Donald Trump coming to power, of really saying to myself, what are we all doing here as artists? What are we doing in the arts world? If the world is on fire, what are we called to do now? And really, the book came from a place of despondency, actually. And I wanted to go back in history and look at the moments where artists have used their creativity as a means of making political change and standing up in the position of resistance. So that's where it came from. And little did I imagine that, when the book finally made it into the world 4 years later, that unfortunately it would be so urgently needed. And yes, so this is a real moment, I think, when we're really called upon to ask what resistance means to us in our own fields. And I'm so moved to see the words of Bishop Marion Edgar Budd and what she said yesterday. It was a moment of true bravery, and I think a reminder that we all need to be asking ourselves what resistance looks like now.
Now, one thing that generally, even at the best of times, confronts artists are commercial pressures. So many artists do not make a lot of money from their art, and even the more successful ones do face commercial pressures too. We've seen businesses fall into line quite rapidly upon the return of Donald Trump to the White House. Do you think there can be a trickle-down effect when it comes to the financing of cultural production?
I mean, certainly in the UK, which is the landscape I know better than France, but I think already there's a sense in which there is a culture of fear around what can and can't be said. And I think, we've particularly seen it in the context of the genocide that's been happening in Gaza. There has been a real reluctance on the part of some cultural organizations to uphold the voices of Palestinian artists, which I found really, really concerning. And so I think, at the moment, particularly in a cultural sector that has so often commercially benefited from the political perspectives of the artists that it showcases, there is a real demand on cultural leaders to say, what do you stand for, actually, and what does ethical integrity look like in this moment? And it might mean taking some risks, and it might mean, there's a real urgent conversation about sponsorship of the arts, and I think we really need to ask ourselves, what does integrity look like in this moment, and what are we going to stand up for? Because I think those pressures are becoming more and more real.
Yeah, you mentioned there artists who have been targeted in the UK, but also in the US and Germany for their stance on the Gaza war. There's also been instances of artists being disinvited for fellowships and exhibitions after pressure from the Chinese government. Could we see more governments acting like this, particularly with regard to things that hadn't been a problem before, like just simply US domestic policy?
Well, I'm not an expert in US domestic policy, and my book is really about looking at historical examples. But I think certainly there's a sense in which, if you look back in the past, very often governments realize before artists do the power of the power of their art, really. And actually, I often think that censorship is one of the most powerful proofs that art really has a meaningful political impact. So, one of the stories I looked at in the book is the story of the Plastic People of the Universe in the Czech Republic. In Czechoslovakia before it became the Czech Republic. They were a band, a really experimental psychedelic rock band, who came under fire from the authorities. There wasn't anything particularly political about their work, but they sort of represented a kind of freedom that a community gathered around that was threatening to the government. And so they ended up being arrested. But this became a real cultural moment for the whole of society. And Václav Havel, who went on to become the first president of the Free Czech Republic, spoke of how inspired he had been by that band and by the freedom that they represented to pursue his own political cause. So, yes, I think there is an increasing risk of censorship, but if anything, that just proves the urgency of artists making and their creativity as an expression of freedom in a moment when it is so under threat.
Do you think there are certain types of political resistance within art that are approved more than others by governments?
I think it varies around the world, certainly. And I think that it can be, it really is a hallmark of a true democracy that artists can speak about anything. To speak to my own landscape, I think clearly there's been a distinction between the ability of artists to speak up on behalf of Ukraine as opposed to speaking up on behalf of Palestine. And so I think there certainly is a sort of political sanctioning of what opinions are acceptable, even in a relatively liberal democracy.
And what for you is a particularly shining example of an artist resisting politically that you've drawn from your own research?
I mean, there's so many stories from around the world. I think, that what I found particularly moving is looking at situations where artists, under the most immense pressure of conflict and war, have chosen to make art. So I spent a lot of time looking at what happened during the siege of Sarajevo, and particularly a production of Waiting for Godot that was directed by Susan Sontag. And it's the most extraordinary story because this group of artists came together in Sarajevo and said, even, risking our lives to come every day to the theatre, even under the, hail of shell fire raining down on us, it's so, so vital to us that we come and make work. And they made this production of Waiting for Godot, in a bombed out theatre with no electricity. The actors were, struggling for food. They had to lie down in rehearsals because they were, really starving. And they made this production of this fairly, esoteric, obscure modernist, well, not obscure anymore, but esoteric and kind of modernist play that didn't necessarily explicitly speak to the conflict, but that contained something that felt vital. And the audiences came, and they came through the sniper fire, and they packed that theatre out. And for me, just to look at moments like that when, in the midst of the most oppressive and violent circumstances, people still reach for their creativity, and perhaps even more so than ever say, we need to be doing this now as an expression of our humanity in the face of the forces that would seek to destroy it, is very moving to me, and is a reminder of exactly why this is so urgent.
Thank you very much for that, Amber Massey Blomfield. And if you're in Paris, Amber will be discussing her book Acts of Resistance, The Power of Art to Create a Better World at Shakespeare and Company tomorrow evening, the 23rd of January at 7 p.m.